All right, so my guest today is AbdulShaheed Drew, who is sometimes styled as AbdulShaheed or Shaheed Drew. He's an author and a historian who focuses on the history of Muslims in Australia. He wrote 40 hadith relating to Islamic finance and has been working on a larger project about Muslims in Australia. And the project, as I understand it, it explores early contact, community development, cultural intersections, and institution building. He has also contributed to documentaries and podcast work and features in the 2007 documentary Muslims in Australia, which was narrated by him. And he shares his findings about things like Afghan cameliers, first mosques, and issues of Muslim identity in Australia. So that's my introduction for you. Can you just tell us a bit about what inspired you to write this book on the history of Muslims in Australia?
Sure, no problem. I would say when I was a university student doing my undergraduate studies at Deakin, I remember we did one subject about the what Muslim history, just one subject that included some of the Muslim history, and that fascinated me. So I went to the library and grabbed all the books that I could on the topic, and I found, it was interesting. But I realized that there's no way that the public can access this information. So it was very academic. It was for a niche audience. It was scattered references here and there, like one particular topic on, say, the Afghan cameliers, another one on, say, pearl divers, or one archaeologist might write a journal entry here, and there's so much scattered work. So what I wanted to do is gather it all together and then somehow present it to the public to give them greater access. So I'd say I found it fascinating to start with. And then at the same time, I felt like the greater community needs to know this. It's amazing. It's quite rich, more rich than we can imagine.
Awesome. I hope I covered everything in the introduction, by the way. How did you approach your research and what sources were most valuable in your opinion?
So I started with the libraries, and then I would probably check out a few museums. I would also look on archives to see what's available. I would, I guess, travel to some of these historic sites because you could read about them, but then you think about, well, is there some remnants behind that I can check out? So we'd sometimes go on road trips, family road trips, and I drag my family along, or we may be on our way to a certain destination, and we'd stop by some of these places that have a Muslim presence to them, at least over 100 years ago. Quite pleased to find that there were some, say, small collections of artifacts that were kept preserved by some of these historical societies. It the thing is, when you start researching it, it opens up all these other doors, and then you go from the libraries, you start going down deeper avenues, you start connecting with some of these academics themselves, the ones who wrote these books, and they're happy to share some of their information, some of their photos from these sites that are hard to reach. So then it just starts to snowball and it gets bigger and better. And I think that that works in any field where you start investigating, it just opens doors for you. And then you travel to some places and you realize, hey, I found something that's not in any of the books. And then it's like, it's like you've discovered gold. And I'm gonna add that to my book. You know what I mean? But it's a very slow process, and it involved a lot of research at first, then a lot of traveling, then a lot of emails to certain people, and then it just became a lot of information. Like you could write an encyclopedia on this. But the only problem is with that, the not many people would want to read that much information. So I'm trying to make it condensed, the most interesting aspects of this history, and probably the ones where we can derive the most lessons from. we don't want it to be too boring as well.
Awesome. Were there any surprising or overlooked discoveries you made while working on this project?
I would say, let's just say we only know the basic history, like the Cameleers. Then some people talk about the Macassans and they go, yeah, we know a little bit about the Macassans. That's pretty much as far as it goes when it comes to the early Muslim history. So what you start to find is, okay, let's go into details of these topics. And I find that for me, it's more interesting as a, say, a mediocre historian, someone who loves history in general. I would find that when you find details that are factual and documented evidence about these things and a bit more like deeper stories, people's names, you start to go and discover, more intimate details of these peoples and their lives and their struggles in life, then it becomes more interesting. But you could say there are so many, like every page, this is why I'm not exaggerating, every page is jam-packed of information. Although it's an illustrated book that I'm writing, I've already finished it. It's just in the final stages now to send it for print. Every page is jam-packed with information. So me trying to gloss over it and say, yeah, there's lots of information there, I need a bit more specific. And I'm sure more specifics will come up in this conversation, inshallah.
Sure. So I think you mentioned the Macassans. There's some people even living in Australia who have no idea who the Macassans are. Can you give us a brief overview?
Yeah, so in the Malay Indonesian archipelago, there's like thousands of islands. One of those islands is Sulawesi Island. Um, it used to have a large Islamic kingdom, the Kingdom of Goa, in the 1600s, and there was obviously the Dutch had an interest in these islands, the Spice Islands that surrounded the region, but the Kingdom of Makassar in particular, which is Makassar, is also an ethnic group in South Sulawesi, and the capital of Sulawesi, the Southern Peninsula, is also Makassar today. So we'd call them Macassans, but they may have there may be people from different ethnic backgrounds, most notably the Bugis tribes who are from that region as well. So anyway, let's just say people from Sulawesi, they are commonly identified as Macassans who would visit Australia's north every year, and they would do so in the purpose of collecting taripang as they call it, which is a sea cucumber, or what else do they call it? Sea slug. They have some scientific names for it as well, but they would collect these every year and return back to Sulawesi, and then they would trade with the Chinese who were docked at the port of Makassar. And the Chinese would sail back to China and sell it there as a delicacy. So this trade was going on, let's say, documented evidence points to the mid 1700s, but then you've got some historians who try to push it back to say somewhere in the 1600s this may have been taking place. But 1700s, we have Dutch records saying that the Macassans would visit Australia every year, and that was in 1754, that Dutch document.
Fascinating. So, on that same note, would it be possible to speak further on evidence of early interaction between First Nations people and Muslim visitors before European colonization?
Yeah, no problem. There's like uh, with the Aboriginal contact, between Muslims and Aboriginals, it predates the even Captain Cook's uh, like yeah discovery of Australia. So it predates the European settlement, of course, and the Muslims would be visiting. So let's say if we went by the Dutch records and the Muslims were visiting from 1754, and there were sporadic visits at that time, um, we could say that there was a strong contact between the Aboriginals and the Muslims from Makassar. There was a strong contact. they built strong friendships. They learned each other's languages, and this was like an annual event. So there's records of the Aboriginals who would be excited when the season came for the when it's like they had like 6 seasons in the north, 6 seasons which they could identify based on the weather systems, the plants, and things like this. And they would get excited when it was the season for the Macassans to arrive. When they would arrive, they would bring with them trade goods, and they would also employ the Aboriginals. So that it wasn't like they would take advantage of them. They treated them as equals. They treated them as they would anyone else, and they would trade with them. And then the Aboriginals would, um, in like for wages or for obtaining some of these goods, they would work for the Macassans. So obviously they built strong friendships. And then as time goes on, you've got the Aboriginals who are learning Macassan language, the Malay language, or it's the Bugis language. Allah knows best what languages they learn. It's kind of like most likely the Bugis language they would learn. Aboriginals traveled to Sulawesi Island, and some of them stayed there, and many came back and told their stories. And then they become accustomed also to the foods and things like this. So you have them eating rice in the north, okay, as a normal food that they would store and eat, or they would ask others to give them rice and trade with rice and things like this. So it was quite a fascinating, it's quite vibrant part of the year. And this was only along the northern coast of Australia. At least in the 1700s, it was taking place, but it may have happened before that.
Okay. Just out of my own curiosity, how strong was the relationship? Was there any intermarriage taking place or anything of the like?
Yeah, there definitely was uh, intermarriages between the two cultures. Like I said, there were Aboriginals who went to Sulawesi, males and females, and many of the females ended up living in Makassar, married to Macassan men, Muslim men. So you could say, presume that, oh yes, there were many Aboriginals who lived in Makassar. Not, it wasn't on a large scale. So, but there are examples of that. And likewise, some had Aboriginal wives maybe in Australia. They had children in Australia, and they would visit them each year. However, these kind of relationships weren't the norm. They were like, there's here and there's a marriage taking place. You could say these people were visitors every year for 4 months, and they would travel. They wouldn't just sit in one place for 4 months. It was like they would set up a camp and then travel along the coast to another camp and then travel. So it's more like we're visitors and we communicate with the locals and then we head back home. But then you get some cases of people traveling back with them and living in Makassar, males and females. And obviously, some of them, you presume they became Muslim if they lived in Makassar and adopted the culture there, married into the culture, that type of thing. But not on a large scale.
Very interesting. Do you think the Muslim presence before European settlement has been understated in mainstream history books, perhaps?
Yeah, we have studied obviously a very Eurocentric focus in history, and even in the Australian curriculum, I haven't looked at it recently. Years ago, I remember there are little mentions here and there of Macassan contact, but it's really um, underrated, you could say, because this lasted for centuries. It like maybe 300 years, you could say, um, and it was positive overall. Of course, you can find some incidents here and there, but we're talking about overall positive contact, language sharing. Language, you got 300 words that have been absorbed into the languages of the Yolngu people, the people of the north, the Aboriginal languages in the north, and then there's other language groups which have also adopted words from Indonesia into their vocabulary. So then you see, like, well, this is so positive. It's a big part of Australian history, but at the same time, it's really dismissed. It's just there, like a few people know about it. So that's what I want to do now. I'm trying to help promote this kind of history, to have a more, you know, like broader look at history. That's the way I look anyway. I try to be objective, try to see what is the real history of Australia, what is the early contacts, and it happens to be, quite a vibrant history, which is underrated to say the least.
In your opinion, how did the arrival of Europeans basically affect early Muslim visitors to Australia?
So the early European colonization of New South Wales did not affect the Muslim contact to the north at all for the first few decades or so. It was not that it's like they're so far. Australia is a vast landmass, and you've got the Europeans who colonized on the eastern side, and then over time, for example, Matthew Flinders, he's the first man to circumnavigate Australia. So he was given that job in the early 1800s. So in 1803, he's traveling along the north, sailing across the north, mapping and drawing the coastline of Australia to give, an accurate map of Australia. And then he comes across the Macassans. And in his writings, because his journal's still around, and I've got a few quotes from it, he he wrote that he was surprised. He knew that there was some kind of contact there before. He wasn't sure if it was Chinese, or there was some remnants that they explained that there were people there, from outside, other than the local Aboriginals. So he had some, like, maybe some artifacts that he came across. But then when he saw a boat, he was surprised. So then the boat and some canoes, and then another boat pulls into the shore, and then they approach with their little, like a small boat that they had on their big ship, and they approach with their fingers, with their hands ready on their guns, right? They go, I don't know who these people are. So he was so surprised. He doesn't know who these people are that he's going to meet. For those people he's going to meet, this is their normal yearly, this is their run where they do it every year. So that was interesting. So there's two cultures coming together at this time. Flinders realized they put a white flag up, which means they're friendly, they mean no harm, and then a conversation takes place, and then they spend a couple of days together. And Matthew Flinders writes down everything he sees, and it's just people working, setting up camp, collecting the sea slug or the sea cucumber, boiling it, cooking it, smoking it to preserve it, and then traveling back to the Indonesian archipelago. So you see that took place. But then to move on, to fast forward a little bit more, there are some forts or settlements that were set up by the Europeans, by the British or the Australian colonies along the north. And then they would have yearly contact with the Macassans. And then eventually, as the years passed by, the Australia, um, the government introduced license restrictions on the Macassans. So every time you visit here, you have to pay some of your merchandise that you would trade with the Aboriginals. We want you to pay tax from that. And this may have, reduced the numbers to some extent, but then eventually in 1906, a letter went out from South Australia. It went to the Dutch, who had an embassy or a consulate in South Australia, telling them that the people of Makassar can no longer do trade here anymore. So it was barred from 1906. 1907, that pretty much was there's no more. From 1906, that was the last fleet of boats that arrived. The next year, only one boat turned up, and it had a letter asking about this. Is it a real rule? Is it, can we not visit anymore? That type of thing. But yeah, that was it. The end of industry. And the people who were slowly colonizing the north, Europeans, they thought they could replace this industry and take it over. But they were unable to do it like the Macassans. At the same time, the Macassans had built strong relationships with the Aboriginals. Unlike the Europeans, they were not able to build such a strong relationship. So the Aboriginals were disappointed that their friends could no longer visit, and this these trade and work opportunities were no longer available, and then the Europeans could not replicate it to the same level, and the respect was definitely not the same.
Yeah. So my understanding is that the Macassans, it's probably a central theme in your book or your project that is upcoming. What
Yeah,
role in general did Malay Muslims play in Australia's maritime history, according to your understanding?
what role did they play in the maritime history? Other than that, the annual visits, you've got the Macassans. You also have later on in the 1800s Malay pearl divers, who they may have arrived from different countries, like from Singapore to, different parts of the archipelago. They call them Malays, but it's like they could have belonged to any ethnic group within the archipelago. You also had Javanese sugarcane workers who were indentured workers. They worked in Queensland. We still have descendants from those families today who live in Australia, and some live in the same areas where their forefathers used to work in the 1800s. So you have the Malays in general. As if you look at the map, it has a very Indonesia and Malaysia have a very close proximity to Australia. So it's by no surprise there. It's just not really talked about that much. But the pearling industry, that's another big chapter as well. I don't go into too much detail like I do with the Macassans. Like you did say, I do have a large chapter about the Macassans, but that's only to try and cover every aspect of it because I feel like this information is not really presented all together in one place. So I tried to give a lot of details to that. I also try to give a lot of details to the culture in Sulawesi and that old kingdom that used to exist because the Dutch took over that kingdom and then things changed throughout the 1600s and 1700s due to the Dutch colonial ambitions. But yeah, you could say the Malays is a big part of it.
Fair enough. Can you, those of the listeners that may not be aware, Australia was once a penal colony to the British. Can you tell us more about Muslim convicts, perhaps, that were transported to Australia? What do their stories potentially reveal about the society of the time?
Yeah, sure. So we do have a number of convicts that arrived in Australia. You can tell by their Arabic names. You've got people from who were maybe, for example, maybe Indian background. Maybe they like there's one guy, his name Zimran. They call him that. Although we don't know the real pronunciation of his name because there's like 7 or 8 different records of his name. Each one's different, variations of it. He arrived with the Third Fleet, and he was, according to the record, he stole something from a dwelling, from someone's house. He took something from someone's house. What did he take? We don't know. Was it big or small? Either way, he got sent to Australia on a convict ship. So he arrived with the Third Fleet. His grave is in Tasmania. So I've got a photo of that in my book and a bit more about his story. Then you've got some other people who arrive in the decades later. Some from Oman with like an African ancestry. Because as you know, Oman at that time in the 1800s was controlled much of the east coast of Africa. They had quite a big kingdom. And so these people could have been African background, or they could have been from the from Oman, Arab background, or they could have been a mix. So there's a few reports of people from that area sent to Australia. Someone was captured in Mauritius, for example. At that time, Mauritius was probably under the British rule for some time or briefly. So then you got people that may have they've turned against their captain or whatever it was, and because of that, they broke a rule, and that's it. Send them to Australia. So we don't know how severe their crimes were, and as we know, there are stories in the past from people from England who were sent as convicts, and they didn't necessarily do big crimes. It was like just send people here to help develop the colonies. So you have these Muslims from various parts, from Africa, from say Arab backgrounds. One guy's from Iraq background. You've got Indian background, but maybe living sorry, Indian background, but living in England at the time. And you have Bengal. There's a few people I can think of in my head from my mind, thinking about. There's a lot of details I'm missing here. But you see, a lot of them were caught or captured or taken as convicts from these busy seaports which were thriving, a lot of foods, lots of spices, and a lot of cultural contact with different people. Just imagine being those people and then being captured and sent to Australia as a convict. What would be the life living here? It wouldn't have been great. So it would have been a big change in lifestyle for them. Bit of a culture shock.
So that's something that comes to mind as well when you're discussing something such as that. My curiosity is, how would they have practiced their faith? Would they have continued to practice it? In what form? Is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah, we don't know details about that. So when they arrive in Australia, yes, they've got these Arabic names. Later on, some of these names drop off the records, or these people may have finished their term after 7 years. They may have been pardoned or what have you, and they may have returned to their country of origin, or they could have been stayed in Australia and died in Australia. At the same time, like we said, some of the names change by the records of whoever's writing it down at the time. So I would admit that the convicts tracing their trails is a little bit hard. And that's what I would have liked to look into that more, or find more academics who have covered that. From what I've covered in my book, it just gives an idea, like a broad, an idea of what happened at that time. But we all wonder the same question. I can't find the details about their lives. Did they maintain their identity as Muslims? Did they just pray in their house and that was it? They didn't have anything else other than that, or did they have? Did they go back and continue living their lives outside of Australia? A lot of these details are left out, and these are things I find they're very hard to navigate and to find these details. You could say there was a guy. His name was, they call him Odin, and then later on they called him John Odin. So they called him John, and a lot of convicts may have been called Johns after a while because they don't want to say their names if they're not accustomed to pronouncing these names. So you have this guy. His name is Odin. He was probably from Ambon, which is an island in Indonesia. So he was what they call a Malay regiment, and he had to fight for the British in Sri Lanka. So they took him to Sri Lanka to fight there for the British. Well, he joined the locals and he turned against the British. And he married a Sinhalese local from Sri Lanka, and they had children. But then he got captured by the British and then sent to Australia as a convict. So that's like one person you find that, okay, there's a bit more detail about him. What's interesting is they sent his whole family to Australia. So usually they don't do that with convicts, but they sent his family with him. And because he could speak a few languages, they put him at a base at the north where he would speak with the Macassans for 2 years in a row. So he was an interpreter to speak with the Macassans when they arrived for those 2 years. But then he went back to Sydney um, to be with his family, I presume. But he was labeled in newspapers as the man who has the only copy of the Quran in the colony. So this is in the 1830s, I think it is. And he's the only man who has, the Quran, translation of the Quran or a copy of the Quran with him in the whole colony. So then he would charge £5.
Oh, wow. It was a business.
No, well, at least on one report, there was some Lascars. So that's another thing. There was people who were visiting Australia who weren't settling. They weren't convicts, but they'll be visiting Australia for trade purposes or as workers on ships. So he had to bring his copy of the Quran because there was a case of these Lascars who had a dispute with their business partners. someone that was buying a ship in Australia, and these Lascars wanted the return trip back, something like that. And then they said, "Well, you guys need to swear on the Quran." That's the way they looked at it, is that you swear on your holy book. So they said, "We've only got one in the colony. Let's ask Odin." And then Odin said, "Well, he knew that he was the only one that they had access to. So he said, if you want my services, it will cost you £5. And they had no choice but to pay him £5 for his service. This is in a newspaper. So that's another source that I'd have to go through some of these newspapers that academics had, by the way, had already pointed to or alluded to, but I had to go look for them myself, try and get to the raw material, as you could call it.
Very interesting. Um, One would think that there would be a number of, at least logically speaking, perhaps a couple Hufaz that might have made the trip.
Yeah, I'm not sure. All I know is with the Cameliers, you have a few references to those, um, but not really, not necessarily. So let's remember, a lot of people who visited Australia were pretty much here for work purposes, trying to maybe earn a living, that type of thing. They weren't necessarily coming here as, say, missionaries or as preachers and trying to spread the message of Islam in the formal sense. But indirectly, obviously, they would have conversations here and there. But so you have a lot of lay imams, you could call it. So when someone requires an imam, usually they'll grab like an elder and say, you're the imam for us. With the Afghan community, they call him the mullah. And this person he'd have to work to sustain himself and his family. But at the same time, he is leading the prayers and things like that. So you have the Cameliers.
Yeah, that
They
still
they
sort of
have a few.
happens.
What's that?
That still sort of happens today.
Yeah, and that's by default. Like you say, Islam has got this kind of system where people know, the one with the most Quran, he leads the prayer, or the elder, these types of things. And that's what you do. You do your best with what you've got.
Sure. So part of the project, you mentioned Lascars already. There's also indentured workers. In your opinion, how did their experiences differ from those of convicts?
The Lascars. Oh, sorry, the indentured workers. So the indentured workers includes quite a broad range of people. So in one of my chapters, I've got indentured workers as a topic. I think it's Muslim convicts, Lascars, and indentured workers. So I've got it as one whole chapter, chapter 4. Regarding the indentured workers, this can include Malay pearl divers. It can include the Javanese sugarcane workers. It can include what else happens in the north in Queensland? Like there's people that like laborious jobs. They were employed. When you're an indentured worker, it means you work for one person. That's it. You can't just change jobs and go. If you're not happy, go to another boss. So they're pretty much working um, like basic conditions, and even if some of their rights, like they have to demand some of their rights, they don't really have much choice. They just have to take what they've got, really. That included the shepherds as well. So there were shepherds who worked in Australia. There's one guy, he was buried, he died in 1870. And if you know where the Grampian Mountains are, the Grampians, so it's on the other side of that. He died there as a shepherd. It said buried where he died, 1870. And his name is Muhammad Pasha. So, Pasha is like a title usually given from the Ottoman Empire. So, either someone in his family or he himself had some connection with the Ottoman Empire. So, he died as a shepherd. But why are there shepherds there? Because having a shepherd for a low wage was easier or cheaper than building large fences. At that time, Australia was the leader in supplying wool. So, you had these like it was easier just to have a large flock of sheep on your land grazing to make a lot of money in those days. So there were shepherds as well who were included in this category of indentured workers. There's banana plantation as well. That's the other one I was thinking of. So sugarcane plantations and banana plantations as well. Many of them were like Indian background working because they were cheaper than the Europeans. That's the way they looked at it.
Yeah. So just so that if in case anyone doesn't know, Lascars were South Asian seamen who were mainly from India, Bengal, and the surrounding regions. They
That's
were
right.
usually deckhands and laborers. Is that not right?
Deckhands. Yeah, I'd say deckhands would be a good description of them. The thing is, even these terms were quite broad, and we don't know the specifics of each person, and that's why I guess it's safe for me to put it all under one big category, because the British would probably refer to them with these broad terminologies.
Sure. The Cameleers are perhaps the most well-known part of Muslim history in Australia. What do you think people still misunderstand about them?
Hmm. The biggest thing is just how much impact they had on the development or nation building in those early days. This is something that is underrated. So they, like we said, like I mentioned just briefly before, that Australia became the largest supplier of wool. It was like a huge economic boost to Australia to supply wool, uh, to trade with it. So then these people were able to reach these far distant, isolated stations and bring the wool back to the ports, or eventually when they build train lines, they could bring the deliver the wool to these train stations and then to the ports. So economic wise, they contributed significantly. There were people that stayed away from trouble to the most extent. You know, they weren't troublemakers. They were this hard workers. They were known for that, pretty much working every day for many hours a day from the early part of the day to the end. The camels themselves, if they were just riding with saddles and the luggage on the back of the camel, then it's most likely they won't stop all day. They'll just keep traveling because to stop and then take the luggage off the camel and put it back on every time you stop, and it became hard. It's better just to keep traveling, and they may have one major meal a day. And all I can say is that they worked hard, they kept out of trouble, and they also contributed significantly to the country and nation building. So the wool is one aspect. The other thing is they contributed to delivering supplies to the overland telegraph line, which was a huge communication wire from South Australia, say Adelaide or Port Augusta. The line went all the way to Darwin and then underwater, like across the sea, under the water to connect with the international telegraph lines. Then they can communicate with Britain rather than sending a message on a ship, which could take 3 months. Then now they've got this communication wire, which they could send a message within 3 hours to England. So these are like huge steps. If you're like developing a country, these are huge contributions. There's so many more I could say, just saying in general, I feel like they're deserving of more recognition for all the hard work they have done. At the same time, they had to live with a lot of racism, and they were there when the White Australia policy took effect. So they were there before Federation, and they were also there through those early stages of the White Australia policy coming into effect. And they were exempt, of course, from the White Australia policy because they're already working here. But then they had um, exemption certificates, so they could go back overseas and then travel back to Australia with this certificate. But either way, they didn't say they were free from racism. You know, they definitely had so many stories that they did not share. From the ones we see they're bad enough as they are, the way they were treated by some people.
When you say they were treated badly, what do you actually mean in in terms
Oh,
of?
you've got different levels. So you've got institutionalized racism, where by law, there's a certain privilege based on the pigments in your skin, your ethnic background. You've got they're working a lot in the gold mines not the gold mines. There's a gold rush in West Australia, so then laws came out stopping Asiatics from mining for gold, but Europeans were fine. So these people, although they were British subjects, they were also barred from that. So what they did was they supplied the water. They went to deliver water to these gold fields, and they made a business out of that. Um, what else was there? Then you've got the people who were always you see these kinds of lessons and the same groups of people, same arguments popping up every generation. They're trying to steal our jobs. There's too many of them. They're too hard. They charge less than us, that type of thing. So you've got the locals who were against them. You've got what's the other one? You've got some parties like anti-Asian League, anti-Afghan leagues that popped up to try and put a stop to this presence of people. So you've got this the locals fired up by some people in the community who also say they're taking our jobs or they're competing. It's too hard to compete with these people. And then you've got the opposite argument, which is like we can't live without these people. So you've got both sides competing, uh, contrasting each other. People might complain, we don't want camels in our cities. And then they say, well, the camels are instrument to the economy and bringing so much wealth. And the pastoralists, the ones who live in these isolated regions, they rely on this camel transportation. And what these pastoralists are doing is something that is, a great service to the country as well by living in those remote regions. So you got these kind of, they're stuck in the middle of this. At least they were with each other, and they built these basic mosques, makeshift mosques, and they were able to have their own communities where they were able to, you know, talk with each other and get along with each other, as opposed to the convicts who pretty much their identity we don't know much about it, but living in isolation is not healthy. So at least these people had each other to communicate with and to have someone to speak with their own language and things like this. Hmm.
Very interesting. Were there any particular Cameleer stories that stood out to you while you were researching all of this?
That's right. That's the thing. The Cameleer section is one of the largest chapters in the book. And I tried to condense it as much as possible. And then I had to, and when you condense it, you leave a lot of the personal details out of people's lives. And that's one of probably the downsides of printing this book is that it's not going to give you all those close stories of how life was like with some of these people. So I can't even mention all their names because there's so many. There's people's names that people actually contacting me and saying, "Do you know my great grandfather? Do you know him? Can you trace his records?" And I've said, "I've never heard of that person." And then I look at all the list of names I've got, and the name's not there. So there's also names that we don't know of. So I do speak in a broad, you know, like I talk about it in general. But then there's a few isolated stories that I chose just to give some flavor to what life was like back then. So there's probably a couple of stories like trying to think of. There's a guy, he gets shot. He's cleaning. He was in West Australia, and he gets into an argument with a man who shoots him. The man who shot the Afghan, we call them Afghans, but let me just clarify that they came from many ethnicities, language groups, from the borders of, say, India at the time to the Afghan and Baluchistan areas. When I say the border of India at that time, it's what we might call present day Pakistan. So you could say a big bulk of these people came from the present day Pakistan, and including most of the camels came from those regions, from the desert parts of Pakistan today. Um, so there were definitely Afghan cameleers from Kandahar and Kabul, and some well-known businessmen who were well established when they made a good business here with the camel trade and things like this, with delivery service. But then you've got people from India and different regions, different parts of Pakistan today. But there are some stories. I'm trying to think of other than the one. There was a guy, he got shot, and he was apparently making wudu, cleaning himself, making ablution to prepare for prayer. And there was a guy, European man, shot him after an argument. And then he said the reason he shot him because he put his feet in the water to wash. And according to, let's say, the summary of the whole story was it's most likely he wasn't washing his feet in the actual water itself, because there's a record of them. They'll put it in a bucket, then they go elsewhere and use that bucket to wash themselves. But either way, this is the story the European man used. And he said, I shot him because of that. But even that's not death penalty if you're washing with water, even if there's a lack of water in those regions. The area, I have a photo of the location. There's many rock pools, like natural, like collection of water. Wildlife still uses, drinks from those waters, those pools in West Australia. So he got shot, and the guy that shot the cameleer, he pretty much got away with it. The court didn't find him guilty, and then that was it. He There was a huge celebration of the people that were following the case. There was some police that held evidence at the time. They were charged for that later, but there was no retrial. So there's example like that of very sad situations that took place. You've got some people by name who participated in huge exploration feats, like discovering Uluru. The huge monolith in the middle of Australia. Um, the first European to discover that was with a Muslim cameleer whose name was Kamran. His name was Kamran, and both of them climbed the rock up to climb together. And he's describing in his journal that Kamran will be barefoot climbing up the mountain, up not the mountain. I mean, it's like a mountain, but it's a huge rock, orange monolith. So you've got these kind of exploration stories as well. You've got particular names of Muslims who were with these famous explorers in different parts of Australia. I'm trying to think of so many from my head, like in my book, but I haven't got it in front of me, so they're not coming to mind. I'm sure I'm going to kick myself after this, after this is over, and I'll be thinking I should have said this name.
That's okay. So a hawker is a person who travels around selling goods, often carrying them from place to place rather than running a fixed shop. This was something that existed. How did this kind of lifestyle shape the identity of these individuals and their relationship with wider Australian society? Because I understand some of them were most likely Muslim.
Yeah. So the Hawkers were they had a presence in the 1860s onwards, and there could have been some before that, but let's say from the 1860s onwards is quite a few details about these people who usually from Indian background. We also have hawkers who are from a Syrian background, which is the part of Syria that they came from is present day Lebanon. And at that time, they were formerly under the Ottoman Empire, and they were most likely Maronite Christians, the Lebanese or the Syrian hawkers. But the ones that probably the most in number came from India, and there's more details about those, their lives, more newspaper articles about them. So they'll be like mobile stores. There's no Westfield shopping centers back then, so people who lived in the country towns, and obviously they were here when Australia was still colonies. Australia was still these little pockets here and there before Federation, and these people would bring items of interest, things that you need, and things like luxury items as well. Could be anything from soap to needles, some clothing, anything, you name it, footwear, all bits and pieces. So it was quite exciting when the hawkers arrived into town. It was exciting for the locals. They were like they used to appreciate this service. So the hawkers would go to their these areas where there were businesses, collect goods, purchase them, and then take them out and sell them, either for themselves or on behalf of the company that supplies the goods. And they were, what do you say, mobile, but at the same time they had their friends. They were able, some of them were able to buy land as well. And then you have reports of them. They'll be sitting around on a fire, and they'll be sitting around speaking, socializing, and singing together, things like this. So they had their own kind of small communities that they caught up with here and there. But then you also had complaints against them, saying that they're a nuisance. And, like we said before, that you've got both sides. You've got people that really appreciate them, and then you've got those who really can't stand these people who they believe shouldn't be here.
It sounds like telemarketers before telemarketing. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
So in any case, were they more accepted, do you think, because of their economic role? You mentioned that there was a kind of disagreement in terms of where to place them. Those who accepted them, did they accept them because of the economic goodness that they brought in, perhaps?
I would say that they were providing a service that was needed at the time. And that's what most people do looking for work at that time, honest, hard work, that they were providing such a service that was needed. And it was maybe just people that were complaining against it. They were making a lot of noise about it. So, like, and at the same time, they probably felt like they were justified because it's a white Australia at the time, that they were able to make arguments against these people. At the same time, there were amazingly, um, like people that were amazing, like defending them, who were also European. So let's just say the Europeans, they're very, it was a spectrum of beliefs and opinions regarding these people. But I guess those people had more knowledge about their services and those who benefit the most, they were positive about it. But people who just didn't like the sight of them. They just didn't like seeing these people. So one guy, one article complained about, we see these people, they're just doing their living and they're socializing. And he wasn't really complaining about anything illegal. And then someone had to respond back. Another European would respond back to the same newspaper saying, I see nothing wrong with these people, and that they're all, he was speaking from a Christian perspective. He said that we are all human, mankind, that type of thing. So anyway, that's just the way it was. It was important, but at the same time, they're making money of a need that is required. They see that people need this service, so they filled that gap at the time. Another problem was in Victoria, you could only get license fees. They had to pay their license fees or apply for them on the same day. So there'd be a huge line of mostly Indians lining up to get their license, which it's a strange way to do it, but they do it all in one day.
Very interesting. Moving ahead a little bit, how
Yeah.
did the White Australia policy affect Muslim communities specifically, in your opinion?
Hmm. Muslim communities at that time were mostly, you had, there were, for example, the ones who were living out in the country, small towns, delivering the wool and things like this with the cameleers, they had their own little Gan towns. So for them, I don't think much changed in that sense. It's just that more, like it's life as normal for them to a certain extent. In the cities, there were also Muslims from different backgrounds. There's a guy whose name is Musa Khan. He writes a letter to a newspaper author, or what's his name, William Quilliam. You've heard of him in the UK. I think in 1893, he wrote a letter to him asking for the newspaper to be sent to Australia in Victoria because they have like 300 Muslims or so that are interested to, benefit from this newspaper. And he mentioned in his sentence, including some converts. So in his request, and then he also asked for back issues. So this is before federation. So these Muslim communities, they existed, but you'd probably, as you know, Muslims, if they don't have a real like mosque that's identified by the government, then what are they going to do? They're going to pray in their houses, that type of thing. So there's not much of a presence, but they were there. But you got people like, I think his name was Alan Mostyn later on, that was his name. He arrived here during the White Australia policy. He changed his name to Alan Mostyn. I forgot his original name, but he's from the what do they call it? The Nawab of Bengal. Yeah, the Nawab. He was like the son of the Nawab of like he's like a prince. But to come to Australia, he studied in Oxford, I think. He went to England, he studied there. But then to arrive in Australia, he changed his name to a more European sounding name. And even he lived low key. Just his close friends knew about him. Maybe he had some contacts here and there, but nothing public. No, not much details about it.
Interesting. And something you mentioned just in your last discussion, you mentioned that there was a presence of converts that was there.
Yeah, you've
I
got.
would imagine there's not much information. Would that be fair to say?
There's definitely not much information. There's one in particular I'll mention about the newspaper. He started the newspaper. I think he was a Presbyterian or something like Christian, and he became a Muslim, and then he went to publish a newspaper. They only made one edition, so there was no second edition. And that's as far as that story goes. And that was when was that? 1931. Yeah, 1931. His name was Sheikh Abdullah, formerly Presbyterian, named J.A. Grafton. And he was in Redfern in Sydney. If you know Redfern, in Sydney, this is where he was located. And that's where they published this newspaper, but it was only one edition. And the name of the newspaper, I'm trying to look at the small print in front of me right now. Oh, I can't see the name of it. Oh, Islam, the Mohammedan Torch, which is a strange name.
It's an
Islam, the Mohammedan Torch.
okay, very
But
interesting.
Mohammedan was a title that was common in the late 1800s, and Muslim. So Muslim, but M-O, Muslim or Mohammedan. Even when Matthew Flinders met the Macassans, he said, these people are Mohammedans. So that's probably why he used that title.
Interesting. So, in what ways have Muslim Australians perhaps contributed to the shift towards multiculturalism? Uh, would it be fair to say they did contribute?
You've got a presence of Muslims, continuous presence, even though they're from different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, and many of them did not cross roads with each other, cross paths. Some did. There are some, like there might be a Malay married an Afghan, person from a Malay Aboriginal background, because there's Malays that may have married Aboriginals. And then there's like Afghans who married, you know. So there are some contact between these different groups and backgrounds and people who work in different areas of Australia. But overall, you've got different waves of Muslims coming at different times to different parts of Australia, but there's always a presence. You could say it contributed to this way, like it paved the way to multiculturalism in a way, because there's always this presence and they were needed. And regardless of the odds against them, they kept working and persevering through, the difficult times and the racial abuse or the setbacks or living as a kind of pip, on the fringes in some cases or marginalized to some extent. So these people persevered through those times of difficulty and maintained a presence. And then finally, the Afghan Cavaliers, they are the ones who built the first mosques, permanent mosques in Australia. The oldest mosque in Victoria is 1960. Do you remember which one that is? Who built that?
This is the one in Darwin, is it not?
No, no, in Victoria. I mean,
In Victoria. Oh,
it's not Afghans though. It's another group.
okay. Is it the Lebanese?
No,
No.
before the Lebanese.
Hmm.
So is it 1960 by the
Albanian.
Albanians?
Yeah. Okay.
So the Albanians, they arrived while Australia was under a white Australia policy because Europeans were accepted, including Eastern Europeans. The general rule was you come to Australia, but you assimilate to the culture. So although it's a white Australia, and even if people have fair skin, they're expected to adopt the Australian British culture. So then, but that, I mean, these are Muslims. So you got from Europe. You've also got the Bosnians in the say 1940s, first say group of Bosnians, former Yugoslavia back then, and then you've got say the 60s and then the 90s. The largest Bosnian migrant group were in the 90s due to the war. But then you've got Albanians from the 1920s. You've got Christmas Island and Cocos Island. So Christmas Island, I think, was 1955, joined Australia. And as you know, Christmas Island is closer to Indonesia than it is to Australia. And the Cocos Islands, I think, in the 1980s, they joined Australia as well. And they're also just close by to Christmas Island. So then you have a large number of Muslims from those islands move to the mainland of Australia for education and work purposes. Um, and they are Australian citizens, obviously, from those dates officially. And so then you have different ethnic groups always living in Australia, having a presence. You could say when the Colombo Plan took place, the Sri Lankan that agreement between different countries where they would allow people from different countries in Asia to work in these countries, and Australia was one of those countries, allowed them to study here, and then many stayed and worked. So then you find that this is just all contributing bit by bit to uh, a presence of multiculturalism in general. So in the 50s and 60s, they weren't worried about assimilation to the full extent, but they allowed integration, where you adopt the local culture to a certain extent, but you keep your culture indoors and practice your religion, your belief system, all that stuff. So then you could say people from all these different backgrounds they contributed to this slow progress. But finally, in the 1970s, Australia politicians were using new words that they weren't using before, like cultural pluralism and things like this. And then we worked our way up to the multiculturalism, which I find is the most, successful out of all the previous, like compared to integration and assimilation periods, multiculturalism. But at the same time, people do integrate. We do integrate, obviously. It's just that you're free to practice your faith. You can come from any background, but legally you're Australian and you should have the same rights as everyone else. Um, Although it sounds so positive, we can see in recent weeks, recent years, there's always going to be back and forth and questioning this and that type of thing. But overall, I'd say it's a very positive part, a very positive change in our history.
Awesome. So, do you see any parallels between earlier Muslim struggles for acceptance and the challenges that Muslims might face today? You've touched on a few things here and there, but I'm just wondering if it's something that you've thought of.
Can you say that again? I missed a bit of it.
I just said, do you see any parallels between earlier Muslim struggles for acceptance and the
All
challenges
right.
that Muslims are facing today?
Yes, that's a good question, actually. I realize my entire book, although I'm not specifically telling people how to think, but it's more like just laying all the details out. One big lesson you will take from that is that a lot of people do slowly lose their religion over time. Their children, they grow up And that's an identity crisis that many of the early Muslims had. So they have children that grew up in Australia, Muslim names, Arabic names, but they didn't know anything about the homeland of their parents. They never even took them there. The ones that did take them there, they seemed to benefit the most, who had a visit to the homeland of their parents. But the ones who grew up here, um, they really lost that strength of being a Muslim, the identity. So that is one of the biggest challenges I found from the descendants, that they lose their Islam within a generation from the early periods, like the Afghan Cameliers. You know, only in some cases the people they rediscover Islam or they had a connection that continued. But in general, the overwhelming majority of them lost their religion and they kept their name, and that's pretty much it. But they lost the culture within a generation or two. But then that's a similar thing that might happen, but to a less extent, um, for current generations and just, within the last few decades. This is an issue that people have to consider and think about.
Yeah, I think you once even told me a while back that there are even those who have Afghan ancestors and then last names are Sultan or Muhammad or something of the like.
Yeah, there are definitely Aboriginal families in different parts of Australia who still have these surnames. And they know their history, they know their family, the names and who their great grandfathers were. So maybe their mother, I mean not their mother, their great grandmothers became Muslim or they remained Christian. So the Afghans, either they married someone who converted to Islam or who was Christian as such. So you have Aboriginal women, for example, who grew up on missions. They may have they themselves were separated from their families or what have you. They got there's bits of Aboriginal history that I have to touch on just to give people an idea. So although it's not a history about the Aboriginal life in Australia, but there's no way of avoiding talking about the Aboriginal history throughout and the Muslim contact and how things were for both sides, for both living in Australia as through the colonies and through Federation. But yeah, there's definitely lots of names, lots of surnames still out there.
Okay. So as we move towards concluding, what do you think or what do you hope readers, regardless if they're Muslim or non-Muslim, will take away from your work? What would you hope for them to take away from your work?
This is based on the way I see it and the way I tried to write it is it's so broad. It should appeal to a large range of people, like a wide audience from young to old, from the people who have a prejudice towards Islam and to those who are very accommodating and, they have, broad cultural understanding and all the in-betweeners, okay? Because it's an illustrated history book, it's got lots of pictures throughout. Every page has got an image that in itself it speaks a lot. Each picture, the oldest images. So we've had since the introduction of the camera, the commercialization of the camera in the 1800s, we've got some of these photos of Muslims working in Australia. But if I was just writing about it, saying yes, there was Muslim cameleers working, it's not the same as having a picture there showing them working and loading their camels and what they wore and how they looked and things like this. So that speaks the language that everyone understands, the pictures. That's a powerful tool. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is I've academically referenced the whole book. Everything throughout is referenced. Each page at the bottom, I've got the footnotes on every page, quoting either historian, anthropologist, archaeologist, someone of repute, someone who can back this information up. So therefore, it's not like, oh, I'm making this up. So whoever reads this, it's like, wow, this is interesting. They're definitely going to learn something they never knew before. But at the same time, it may challenge some of the prejudice that they had if they come from that background, or it might just make them appreciate Like, wow, how much we don't know about these people. Or it might be like, say, me growing up in Australia, I felt like I was lied to a lot in history, saying we only learn one side of history. So now it makes me question a lot about my life. So, anyway, all I'm saying is this book should be for a broad audience. And I'm not deliberately trying to tell people how to think in the book. I pretty much just display the facts. And the facts should just speak for themselves. And depending on who's reading it, they may interpret it, based on their own, their upbringing and things like this.
Fair enough. If you could correct one major misconception Australians might have about Muslim history, what would it be?
Mm. The biggest misconception, I think, is when you ask people, when did Muslims arrive in Australia? They'll say, oh, it's from the 1970s. Yeah. But the thing is, my book covers everything up until the 1970s. So it's pretty much the pre 1970s history of Australia. And that's a huge statement in itself, is that this is a huge, rich, vibrant history. It's not just the Muslim history. This is Australia's history. This is like a chapter in this continent's history. And that's why it's important as well. People need to know this. And I would also think about people in different countries. If they want to know the Muslim history of Australia, then this short, concise, it's what, 184 pages. That's the final count of pages. Um, it will tell them all they need to know in a nutshell. Like, because we've got the history of, say, the early empires. We've got, different kingdoms around the Muslim worlds. And you've got these, in Africa, Asia, and Europe, different, Muslim history is there, but what's the history of Australia? So that's why I felt like this was my responsibility to try and put it together in one small package and contribute to, give my part to my contribution according to the best of my ability. That's the way I see that this book is going to help now, with Muslims saying, yep, we're not from the 1970s. We're not recent migrants. We're not these perpetual migrants as we're perceived to be, even though we're Australian. Some of us have lineage going back generations. Some of us migrated now and some of us converted to Islam. But Muslims have a presence here. And it's a deep, rich history. And it might help future generations build on this. If we can kind of get this information out to the public, like, yeah, this is a Muslim presence in Australia. It goes way back and it's quite rich and it contributes well to the nation building. Then rather than explain to everyone our story, well, they should already, hopefully they get the basic introduction through this book, and they can build on that, inshallah.
It sounds good. You've obviously put a great deal of time into this project. What do you hope future historians or writers will continue to explore in this particular field?
The way I feel about future historians, writers, I feel like there needs to be a bit more collaboration, um, especially in the fields of media, because so many people write books, but they do end up for a niche audience. They don't really appeal to the greater public. And there's so many misconceptions out there. I've also included lots of data about, the level of understanding about Islam according to some data reviews and things like this by academics. So there's a lack of understanding about what Islam is, even though Muslims are like 1/5 of the world's population. Why don't people know much about it? But at the same time, for the future, I think there should be more collaboration between multimedia, people that work in film or media or able to do some kind of multimedia presentations in collaboration with some of these historians, rather than just write the books. It needs to be a bit more appealing to a wider audience. And then they could narrow in on some of these aspects. Rather than talk about the broad, they might focus in and narrow in on one aspect of this history, but present it in a way that the general public can digest it easily, especially through visual imagery.
So, lastly, thank you for your time. It's been a very interesting experience, and a lot of you've told us a lot of interesting perspectives and facts. So I just wanted to thank you lastly, and I hope the project goes well. And I'll try to put the link up along with the video.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time. And I'm sorry if I just I wasn't fully prepared today, but there's bits of information there. Hopefully, people will get the idea that there's a rich history, and more information will be out soon, inshallah.
All right, thank you, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as they say.